chapter 16, 18, and 19. And I kind of mentioned yesterday, yes. Oh, you need all of that stuff, don't you? Hold on a minute. Yes, I got you. Okay. Two things. Don't forget about test corrections due by Friday. Tomorrow, I will have a lecture on, so please make sure you listen to it. Chapter 16, we did 17. That was the Manifest Destiny, the short chapter we did right before the break. And then 18 and 19 all are about this movement towards civil war. Chapter 16 is specifically about the institution of enslaving people. 18 and 19 is all the issues that move us toward war. When we get to 18 and 19, it's really important for you to keep in the back of your head, especially as you're getting ready to work on that assignment, the government actions, or I should say government inactions. Why couldn't we do anything, and meaning we, Congress? Why couldn't there be something done to prevent war? War is always catastrophic, no matter what reason countries go to war, valid, moral, attacked. It is catastrophic for a country to be at war. It ruins the economy. It devastates the land. It takes forever for the population to recover because we are losing men in that baby-making population age group, 19 to 30. When you lose a large chunk of that important aspect of the population, your country will have a hard time recovering. And especially when we're talking about in times where women weren't allowed roles in government or commerce or production, you lose a lot. Not saying that other people don't get really rich, because other people get really rich on war, but for the most part, your country is devastated. And when you make war on yourself, it's quadruple folded, if that's a math word, because everything is happening to the people in your country. If we look at, again, as we remember that very first day when we were in here and we looked at the North and the South and how the South had very few large cities, very few major colleges, all of that still has a role to play on the settling of the colonies, but it has a substantial role in the idea of all that fighting took place in the South. And the idea at the end of the war was to totally devastate the South. That's how the Civil War ends. Ulysses S. Grant Tecumseh Sherman says the only way we're going to end this war is to make total war on the South. That's everything. We're going to burn the South to the ground. And that's what's going to happen. And how could that have possibly been avoided? My hometown in Goldsboro, North Carolina, was burned to the ground. There is not a building in Goldsboro, North Carolina that has been a city and a town since, I think, 1704 that is older than 1875. No buildings, because it was burnt to the ground. One of our little historical markers right down the center of our town says this was Sherman's March to the Sea, straight through our town. Burned everything except one building that they used, an old plantation house that they used as a Union hospital. And the reason being was Goldsboro was a train switching station. Burned it. Tore up all the tracks, everything. And it takes a long time to recover from that. So how could that have been prevented? And as students, we need to think about the decisions that Congress made or did not make in leading to this goal. And one of the difficult decisions is slavery. So that's where we're going to start. I want you to always really think about, as we look at and we talk about and use the word slavery and the institution of slavery, that these are human beings. These are human beings that were bought and sold on an auction stand, like today we sell cattle, pigs, anything else. That these people were separated from their families. They were separated from children. Children were used as capital and sold. And that most every plantation's capital was tied up in that property of slavery. So in talking about that and trying to continue to recognize that they're human beings, we also have to talk about that as capital, like a farmer. Like a farmer would talk about a combine, or a farmer would talk about a harvester. And that becomes part of the difficulty when we talk about ending the institution, is how would those farmers, how would those plantation owners be compensated for that capital? And that, again, makes this a difficult discussion when you consider human beings capital. But it is part of the equation. All of the South, the plantation owners, did not have hard, ready cash. Most farmers don't. Their money is in their land and their equipment. And part of their equipment would be people. And so the South had a twofold reason to continue the institution of slavery. One, free labor. And two, I got a lot of money tied up in those slaves. I got 500 slaves. Each one of those slaves in 1860 time is worth about $1,000. That's a lot of money now. It's a heck of a lot of money in 1860. So as a farmer, as a plantation owner, how are you going to reimburse me for that much capital? And that's the problem that we have. What happens to slavery when the Constitution is written in 1789 and ratified? The only mention of slavery is the ending of the slave trade. And the slave trade ends in, it's either 1803 or 1808. I'm sorry about the date. I'm not sure. But it's early 1800s. So that means no more slave auctions. They were over with. And no more importation of slaves coming from Africa. So instantaneously, the price of a slave went up overnight. Also, to add to the difficult discussion of slavery, one of the best ways to get slaves was to make your slaves have babies, because then you got free ones. And so there was a very much instituted mating of slaves by the white slave master and the overseer. It's one of the long-lasting legacies, again, of why African Americans are leery of medical institutions and those types of things, because their lives had been greatly impacted by people messing around with making them, get married and have children. The slave master himself being part of making those children. So it's a difficult topic, but it is important in understanding the significance of this war that we're getting ready to fight. So on page 16, we've got antebellum. Remember, antebellum means before the Civil War. Anybody have questions before we start? Okay. Antebellum means before the Civil War, or a date. So we have a date for that. It's before 1860. Again, we are not a date-driven class, but you need to know 1860. 1860, two things happen. President Lincoln is inaugurated, and states begin their secession. Okay, so 1860. Make sure you know that. All right, so what makes the South need slaves is the crops they grow are labor intensive, and we have king cotton. Picking cotton is a very labor intensive crop to harvest. That if you can imagine, I hope everyone's seen a cotton boll. It's a big sticky thing like this. The cotton sticks inside. It does not want to leave that. It's sticky. It's not like a cotton ball like you buy in Walmart. It's sticky. It's fibrous because inside of that cotton is the seeds, right? And the plant wants to hold on to its seeds. So it's not an easy picking thing. It is a hard job. My granny and my papa were sharecroppers, and my granny says and would often say the hardest job she ever had in her whole life was picking cotton. It's a hard job. The boll itself is prickly, so you have to wear gloves. Your fingers get, and then it sticks. And it doesn't want to go in the bag easy. It sticks to everything. So picking cotton requires a lot of labor. And in that labor, the farmer or the plantation owner gets 100% of its profit if he doesn't have to pay anyone to pick the cotton. And so that, again, is what's going to cause that slavery to spread. The most important reason for the spread of slavery is Eli Whitney's cotton gin that is produced in 1783. The impact: cotton production more profitable, 50 times more effective than picking cotton by hand. And that cotton gin is what's going to gin the cotton and pull those seeds apart. And so instead of having 50 slaves to sit there and pull that cotton apart to get the seed, you now have a gin that you put it in. One person can turn the wheel, it pulls those threads apart, and the seeds drop to the bottom. If you've ever had an old-timey music box that has those little prongs and it's turning this little wheel and it's hitting those prongs, does everybody know what I'm talking about? If you think about those prongs, that's what's pulling the cotton apart and the seeds dropping to the bottom. So now we don't need slaves to do that, and we can put slaves out in the field, and that, again, will start to pick cotton. Cotton will surpass tobacco, rice, and and rice production. King cotton will develop into a huge agricultural factory. Two things with the products of cotton and tobacco is that they suck the nutrients out of the soil. They suck it out in at least 2 or 3 years, which means Southern farmers had to continue to move south. That's a key role in this. If the South had just stayed where they are and didn't want to move westward, we would not have had the issues that we have now, or that we will have then, because that's what causes our problem: westward movement. Because everyone at this point is okay, except our abolitionists, but all of our politicians are okay with slavery where it exists, and that's what we're going to be talking about. Slavery is fine where it exists, but we do not want to extend where slavery goes. And so these will be people called anti-extensionist. That's what Lincoln runs as first. He's an anti-extensionist. And why are they? Because slavery was constitutional. It was constitutional. It was in the Constitution. So if the South would have stayed in their spot, in their geographic range, we would have been fine. But the problem is those two crops suck out the nutrients. And my FFA people, feel free to correct me, but you need to know this part. Why do they need to move? Because once those nutrients that are necessary to provide a certain yield for tobacco or cotton are gone, is you produce less and less on the same field. So if I have an acre field, and I'm going to be really weird, and I can produce 100 stalks of tobacco, next year I'm only going to be able, on that same yield, I'm only going to produce the same 100, but my leaves are going to get smaller, right? And tobacco leaves are big. You want these big, giant tobacco leaves. Each year they're going to get smaller and smaller and smaller to where my yield is not worth the time to put the seed in. All right? Okay. I'm not going to ask Walker because he has his head down. So anyway, so that means I got to move on. We don't have fertilizers yet. We don't have anything to put those nutrients back. So that's why we're moving. The second part of this king cotton that I would like you to put a big box around is trade. The reason that cotton is king is if you look at C3, 57% of all American exports, not Southern exports, the entire exports of the United States of America is cotton. And where is it coming from? One place. Now, one of the discussions we'll have is when we start looking on paper, the strengths and weaknesses of the North and South, just like we did with the Revolutionary War, just like we did with the French and Indian War. When we look at it with the North and the South, I would hope every single one of you would say, what was the South thinking? There's no way they can win this war. Check mark, check mark. That is completely correct. They only had two things going for them. They had better military strategists and generals, and they could stay where they were at. They didn't have to invade anything. That's when Lee made his costly mistakes trying to invade the North. Why did they think? Because they had 57% of the state of the United States exports. That's tremendous. So there was two things they thought. When the United States lost 57% of their exports, there would be some kind of reconciliation with the South holding the upper hand. We control the economy. In a sense, the South control the economy. And when the South leaves, the thought was the North is going to come begging back to us to get back in this economy because 57% leaves. That's tremendous. If there was a company today that had 57% of the exports of the United States, I want a part of that company because that's outrageous. That's a huge, huge number. So now we got to talk about the three Souths. We have to talk about how these different regions of the South had a part and a role in the play. You should know, again, forward thinking, that this is how we get West Virginia. When Virginia secedes from the Union, this region that is now West Virginia said, nope, we don't want to do that. We're not part of this. So the South needs to be thought of in different areas. Tennessee doesn't secede. Those different types of places. So the further north you go, the cooler the climate, the less slaves. So when you think about the South going from Virginia down, and we're not counting Florida. Florida doesn't count in this aspect. And we sweep across to Georgia, Alabama, Louisiana, Mississippi. As you begin that descent down to make that bottom, that's where all the slaves are. Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana. In many of those places, the slave population is larger than the white population. And that is where the vast majority of the wealth in slave owning is located. So again, moving that way, turn the page 2, border states. These border states, you have to know these states. You need to memorize Delaware, Maryland, Kentucky, and Missouri. They're not important now, but they will be as we move closer to Civil War. And they're called the border states because they will be the border between the Union and the Confederacy. And those will be the states that both Congress and Lincoln are holding on to for dear life, that they don't secede from the Union. Many of them are slave states. They have slavery, but what they choose is to remain in the Union and not commit treason against their country. Plantations are scarcer. Tobacco is the main crop in those areas. Again, tobacco requires even more slave help than cotton because it is an incredibly labor intensive. Tobacco has to start in a hothouse. So some kind of greenhouse. So those seeds have to be planted. They have to grow to a certain size, and then they have to be put in the ground by hand. So in modern day, even modern day 21st century, they're still put in by hand. They're still put in by somebody riding in the back of a tractor pulling, dropping them in the ground. That in itself is labor intensive. When the tobacco plant starts to grow, much like what you guys tassel, is it detasseling corn to pop that flower off so the corn ears grow big? You have to do the same thing with tobacco. They're called suckers, and they're a big flower. So you have to top the tobacco and take the sucker off so the leaves grow giant. All of you that I hope have never, ever put a cigarette to your lips. But you have heard, I think, about tar and nicotine. Tar is called tar because it is tar. It is a sticky substance that if you get it on your hands, you can only usually get it off with Clorox. It is nasty. It's disgusting. So when it's time to harvest tobacco, even in the 21st century, you have to pick each individual leaf by hand. There is not a harvester that harvests tobacco, to the best of my knowledge, in the 21st century. It still is picked by hand. The leaves are picked. You have a two-tier harvester, people sitting on the bottom in like seats, and they are even with the rows, and they pick, and there's a conveyor belt that ties it up to the top, and then people at the top tie it on a stick, you get to the end of the row, you take the stick, and then you take the stick into the barn for it to in a gas barn for it to be heated, and so it's cured, and it changes from the green leaf into the fine tobacco. It is incredibly labor intensive, and requires a lot of hands on that stick. So on a harvester, not on stick, on that leaf. So on a harvester, there's usually at least 6 seats on the bottom, and then on the top, usually at least 4 people tying these, and the sticks are about as long as this table. Actually, probably more like this table. And then each one's tied on by hand, by string, tied on. You should watch those people. They can go like crazy. And it's usually, now it's probably done by migrant workers. In my day, it was done by teenagers. That's how every teenager in North Carolina earned money for a car, is working in tobacco. It's disgusting. It's gross. And I did it for what day? There's tobacco worms. They are green. They are like this color green. And they are big and they're fat. And the boys on the bottom would pick them off, and we get to the end of the row, and it's like 9,000 degrees and like 8,000% humidity. You've been under this metal thing, messing with this nasty stuff, and then they would take all the worms and throw them against the barn and mash them, and I'm like, done, out. This girl is not a farm person. That was my one time. It paid really good money, but no, not. So that's why we need this. This is the institution that is being protected. Middle South is Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee, Arkansas. And knowing that North Carolina is always going to be weird. North Carolina is going to secede from the Union, but North Carolina is going to be a weird state because we're going to have these regulators in North Carolina that are anti-plantation owner. At the same time, we're going to have North Carolina amassing their militia to fight the Civil War. North Carolina is going to be weird. And then the lower South, which is what most people think about when they think about the South, that lower South, South Carolina, Florida, Georgia, Atlanta, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, Texas. This is the Cotton Belt. This is where, again, most of the people that have taken the most advantage of using slaves and make the most money. If you look at number 4 on D, and I'll go back, in 1850, 47% of the population were slaves. So 47%, and this is overall. And each had an average of 12 slaves per slave owner. And in the Deep South, 43% of white families owned slaves. And it gets smaller as we go up. The other thing that we have to think about is if 43% own slaves, more people don't. So why were you able to get a large group of people to fight, to go to war with their own country to protect the institution of slavery when they had no chance or hopes to ever own a slave? And it's all about status. It's all about somebody being worse off than me. So as a descendant of poor white cracker trash people, my family lined up. There's somebody worse than me. There's always somebody worse than me. And that, again, is part of that issue. Lastly, before we go too much further, I would just want to really go over page 3 really fast because there's not a lot on that. the top of the page where it says peculiar institution, that's the way that slavery was referred to. That's the way the South referred to it, right? How can we make this not seem so bad? Let's just call it this peculiar institution. The word slavery, the word slaves, very rarely was used in proper polite society. South was ruled by wealthy plantation owners. They dominate. It's the least democratic, poor public education. And I always put little things for my people that follow college sports. Cavalier tradition of early Virginia. If you know anything about Virginia, their little basketball team's called the Cavaliers. Risky system, slaves die of disease, injure themselves, escape, injure themselves. This will be our last discussion, and we'll finish that. It is really important for us to understand that a lot of stereotypical institutions were established in this time period because of the perception of slaves being lazy, not wanting to work. And I would give you this. Those of you that do chores in your house, you probably have two types of parents. One type of parent would be, or two, three. One type of parent is you get finished with a chore, there's another one. You think you're done, nope, there's another one. You finish the leaves, now let's go do the gutters. Oh, you finished the gutters, now let's go clean out the garage. Like there's a never-ending list. If you have that parent, how fast do you work? What? Not fast, because there's another chore. If you have a parent that says, this is me, if you don't do it the way I want it, just stop doing it, I'll do it. If you're a slave, and when you got finished picking that row, there's another row, how fast are you going to pick that row? If you hurt yourself, and that means you don't have to work, how many of you are sick on Saturday morning? Oh, Mom, my tummy doesn't feel so good. Because it's a tummy ache, because you can't prove a tummy ache. Okay. All right. Before we close up, I very, very, very rarely ever give Historian of the Month to AP kids, because you should always be Historians of the Month. But this time, it is somebody that is so deserving for her incredible work ethic, 110% commitment to every assignment, and continued AP improvement, Chloe. So congratulations, Chloe. You are January. Yes, clap for her. You are January Historian of the Month. All right. Did you get your schedule fixed, Ben? Where are you changing to?
It's not, I don't get for doing the same thing. That's the thing.
I could probably
If it
see
stays
the
like
lineup
this,
of the song.
Like I just don't like that. At least not in his class.
Alyssa, I really thought it was gonna be you. I knew it was gonna be you.
That's probably true.
I don't.
You know, it's constant. I have to be almost a secret fan.
Yeah, you're
Constant. Every time I think something better is going to happen. What? Oh. And when I give them to you, chapter 17 is in there, and you don't have to be. Chapter 17. Oh, and cheat sheet is there if you want it to pick it up. My telling of the dream got me way off target. That's okay. Oh, I'm a mess. Okay. I'm sorry it's stapled or hole punched on the wrong side. Those of you that have OCD, sorry.
Do you want to just turn these into the tray or do you want them?
Yeah, put them all in there.
Okay, thank you.
Bye, guys. See you later. They left you, Logan.
I know.
They left you. High and dry. I'm gonna go ahead and open the door.
Yeah, I'm so excited.
All right, see you, Logan. The door's already open. Good morning.
Are you going now?
You walk in the front of the office, you just go to the right hallway and walk all the way back.
Anything else today? I think so. And then I basically just told them, I was like, I already told you I was hanging out. I told you I wasn't
You can't go. Your boss is gonna be there.
so that's actually the issue. That's actually the issue. So
I know, I can tell just by having what you're talking
okay, well, Dustin had to go and run his mouth. I
What's
feel
Dawson
like this
say?
is an issue right now.
about. What did Dawson say?
Is it good salt?
So I asked my mom if I could go. Obviously, I'm not gonna say it. And my mom says yes. If you're outside, so I'm gonna call him about it. And also just try to text him. So if he found out and say I'm going, even though I didn't say for sure if I'm going or not. I don't have any.
Movie.
I'm not because I can't tell Dustin about me.
What's up?
I mean, back.
Shut up. What did we do for?
We haven't done anything. We did not do a single thing in church.
Yes.
We got this packet and then we sat here.
Good. Good stuff.
That's it.
Love to hear it.
Oh, great. We're doing Jim Crow laws, so we're going to be doing all that.
What?
Jim Crow laws. It's the stuff we do.
Where'd you get that?
She gave it to us actually.
Oh.
You missed lifting yesterday. You gonna be a leader or are you gonna? You missed football
It's
lifting.
embarrassing. What am I supposed to do?
Okay, I'm not going to that.
Yes, you are. You gotta be a leader. You go twice a day.
I can't. I have wrestling.
No, you can do both. It's a 30-minute lift. What time does your wrestling start? Yeah, 30-minute lift right after school.
I can't go.
Yes, you can.
I go home and get my wrestling stuff.
You can bring wrestling stuff to school.
I'm gonna go after wrestling.
You do know you can't.
This kid?
We're not in there.
There we are.
No, we're not.
Yeah, dude, it's literally all lifting all through like Christmas, all through Easter, all through summer.
We are not in there after your practice will be done. We will not be
No,
in
not after wrestling this season.
Oh, that's not what he said.
Idiot.
That's not what he said.
Don't call him an idiot, dude. You're so dumb. Shut up, Carter. I will literally.
You don't even live.
I'll beat the brakes.
Carter, where were you?
Oh,
You said that you don't want to be in there for baseball. I was. You weren't in there. At 5?
We had actual practice first. Like, we had
That's not what Jacob said.
what he said.
Jacob said you guys were going to be in there right after school.
Today,
That's unreal.
Idiot.
yesterday we were in there at 5.
Good.
Let's get a look. Oh, thank you so much.
Miss them?
I forgot my.
Oh my god. I don't know. I think you need to go talk to Mr. Gray.
That's what I'm saying.
You need to go talk to the guidance counselor. So you're just gonna be
Are you an idiot?
Oh, I guess.
No, the answer's supposed to be no, I'm not.
Why is it when you sit in a train and you jump, you don't go anywhere, but if you stand on top of the train, you jump. The train moves under you.
Oh, you're asking the wrong person.
Whoa.
I
Let
know.
me stand in the back of your truck and go on the highway.
You are asking the wrong person that kind of stuff.
You're onto something.